in the summer of 1943, the Pacific Ocean stretched wide and merciless beneath a blazing sun. Japanese air power still ruled its scattered islands and the endless blue lanes of sea between them. The sky belonged to the Empire of Japan, and its sword was the Mitsubishi, a 6M0, light as silk, fast as lightning, deadly as a strike from the sun. The Zero was a design born from obsession. It was built for maneuver, not for mercy. It could climb higher, turn tighter, and fly farther than any Allied fighter in the Pacific. To those who faced it, it was not only a machine. It was a ghost that moved with impossible grace, a spirit of fire and smoke. For 2 long years, the Zero dominated the air. Over the Coral Sea, over Guadalcanal, over the Solomon Islands, it reigned without equal. Allied pilots, brave and desperate, fought back with what they had: the F4F Wildcat, the P-40, and early Lightnings. They fought hard, but they bled harder. The Zero always seemed to come back. When American pilots returned to their carriers, their reports were clear and painful. They wrote that the Zero could outclimb and outturn anything in the sky, that it struck from above, vanished into cloud, and returned again before anyone could react. It was more than a weapon. It was a legend. But legends fade when men begin to learn. At the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Company on Long Island, engineers read those same reports in silence. They saw the problem not as failure, but as a challenge. They understood that to beat the Zero, one did not need to copy it, one needed to survive it. Grumman's founder, Leroy Grumman, was a man of instinct and iron logic. He once sketched airplane mechanisms in chalk on the floor when a blackboard would not do. He knew the sea demanded more than agility. It demanded endurance. So he told his engineers, build it strong. Build it simple. Build it to come home. In a hangar filled with blueprints and the smell of fuel, the shape of a new fighter began to appear. It would not be graceful, it would not be pretty, but it would live through hell and come back with its pilot alive. They called it the F6F. Its heart was the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp. 18 cylinders roaring in perfect rhythm, a heart that beat with more than 2,000 horses of power. It was the same engine that pushed the massive Thunderbolt through European skies. Now it would serve at sea. The airframe was wide and strong. The cockpit sat high, giving its pilot a clear view across the horizon. Armor wrapped the seat. The fuel tanks sealed themselves when hit 6 Browning guns lined the wings, like clenched fists ready to strike. Every part of it said the same thing. This plane was built to survive. The first prototypes lifted off from the runway in 1942, and the sky trembled. The climb was steady, the control smooth, but the power was raw and alive. Navy officers watched as test pilots rolled and dived, pushing the machine harder than safety would suggest. When they landed, the engineers already had notes in hand. The plane could do more. A few months later, they fitted the stronger Double Wasp engine, and the result stunned everyone. The fighter leapt into the air with energy no Wildcat had ever shown. The climb rate soared. The top speed broke expectations. The Navy had what it needed, a fighter that could match the Zero in the sky and outlive it in battle. By the winter of 1942, Grumman's factory was alive 24 hours a day. The pounding of rivets and the thunder of engines filled the air. Workers, men and women alike, built the new fighter by the hundreds. They were told one thing above all: this plane will save lives. And as each machine rolled off the line, painted blue and waiting for wings to unfold, the legend of the Hellcat began. No one yet knew what it would do. No one yet knew how many skies it would reclaim. But in every roar of that Double Wasp engine, there was a promise. The sky would belong to the Americans again. Far across the ocean, on airfields carved from coral and jungle, the Japanese pilots trained in the hot silence of tropical dawn. They still trusted the Zero. Completely, they believed nothing could touch it. Their laughter echoed through hangars as they looked at captured photos of the new American fighter. It looked heavy, clumsy, slow. This, they said, this will stop us? They smiled. But the sky does not care for pride, and soon their laughter would fade into the roar of engines they did not understand, because the Hellcat was coming, and with it, a storm that would sweep the Pacific clean. When the Hellcat reached the carrier decks in early 1943, the sea air carried a new kind of sound. The deep rhythmic growl of the double wasp rolled across the waves. Not the high thin song of the Zero, but something heavier, more certain. Pilots who had survived the Wildcat grinned when they climbed into the cockpit for the first time. The controls felt solid. The view was clear. The power came like a wave that never stopped building. When they advanced the throttle, the deck trembled. When they took off, the fighter leapt forward as if eager to fight. At first, the Japanese did not believe the stories that reached them from scattered islands. Reports spoke of a new American plane that could take hits and keep flying, that could dive faster and climb harder than expected. They dismissed it as propaganda. But the reports kept coming. In late 1943, over the Marcus Islands, the first real test began. A group of Hellcats met Zeros in open sky. And for the first time, the kill count favored the Americans. The battle was short but brutal. The Hellcats came home riddled with holes. But they came home. The Zeros did not. From that day, the tide began to shift. Grumman's engineers watched the reports come in and adjusted the design after every mission. Armor was improved. Cockpit frames were reinforced. Each new batch rolled out tougher, faster, meaner. The pilots gave the plane its name with pride, the Hellcat. It was not a sleek predator like the Zero. It was a brawler. It could dive out of danger, turn with precision at high speed, and fire a storm of lead that shredded anything caught ahead of its nose. Its 6 Browning guns spat over 70 pounds of bullets in a single minute. When those guns spoke, the air itself seemed to shake. The Imperial Japanese Navy began to feel the pressure. Their fuel supplies were thinning. Their veteran pilots were gone, replaced by boys with less than 100 hours of flight. They were brave. But bravery does not refill a fuel tank, nor does it stop a 50 caliber round tearing through a fragile fuselage. In the spring of 1944, the United States Navy launched a massive offensive. Carriers steamed toward the Marianas. Hellcats filled their decks, rows of blue wings under the tropical sun, each one humming with readiness. Pilots, briefed beside maps marked with red circles and arrows sweeping across the Pacific. The goal was simple: break Japan's air power. Once and for all, the morning of the Great Marianas battle was clear, bright, deceptively peaceful at dawn. Radar screens aboard American carriers lit up with hundreds of approaching blips. The Japanese had thrown everything they had left into the sky. They expected to meet the same weary fighters as before. Instead, they met the Hellcat. The first wave of Zeros came in high and fast. Hellcats rose to meet them in tight formation, sunlight flashing across their wings. At 20,000 feet, the two forces clashed. In minutes, the sky became a spinning field of fire and smoke. Pilots shouted bearings and warnings. Tracers carved white lines through the air, and engines roared like thunder rolling across the ocean. One pilot later wrote, "They came down from the sun, but they could not climb away. We met them head-on and they burned. By noon, the Japanese formation was broken. By evening, the sea was littered with wreckage. In 2 days of combat, Hellcats destroyed more than 300 enemy aircraft. The kill ratio was staggering, 19 to 1. Commanders who had feared endless losses now stared at the numbers in disbelief. It was more than victory. It was transformation. The myth of Japanese invincibility was gone. The Zero was still beautiful, still graceful, but no longer untouchable. For the young pilots of Japan, every mission now felt like a final flight. They climbed into their cockpits with quiet resolve. Knowing that the enemy they once mocked now ruled the skies, their commanders spoke of honor and sacrifice. But honor cannot turn the tide of war. As the Hellcats patrolled above the Pacific, they owned the daylight. Their pilots learned to hunt in pairs, one drawing the enemy into a turn, the other diving from above with guns blazing. Radio discipline improved, tactics sharpened, and soon even the most seasoned Japanese aces found themselves cornered. Each encounter told the same story. The Zero could turn tighter, but only once. The Hellcat could take the hit and come back. The Zero could climb fast, but not forever. The Hellcat climbed longer and struck harder. When the sun set on the Marianas, the air smelled of oil and salt and smoke. Pilots walked the decks in silence, their faces streaked with exhaustion and disbelief. They had seen something end. The age of the Zero was over, and the age of the Hellcat had begun. When the carriers turned east across the Pacific, the decks were alive with the roar of engines. Rows of blue Hellcats waited for the signal to launch. Their wings folded like sleeping predators. Mechanics checked bolts and lines one last time. Pilots stood beside their planes, helmets under their arms, faces set and silent. They knew what waited ahead. The enemy still had numbers, but not the strength of old. When the signal came, the first wave thundered forward. Engines screamed, wings opened. The deck vanished beneath them as the sea fell away. In moments, the sky filled with the sound of climbing power. They headed west into the sun. At 20,000 feet, the first radar contact appeared. Dozens of Zeros were coming in fast. The Americans tightened formation. Every man on the radio could hear the calm voice of his leader. Stay high. Stay tight. Wait for them to break. The Japanese dove first. Their planes cut down through sunlight like blades. The Hellcats rolled to meet them, their 6 guns already armed, for a heartbeat. Nothing moved but the clouds. Then, the world exploded. Tracers tore across the sky. Engines roared, smoke drifted where planes had been seconds before. The fight spiraled, downward in a storm of sound and motion. The Zero pilots pressed every advantage they knew. They turned inside the Hellcats, trying to repeat the victories of earlier years. But the Hellcats did not follow. They climbed and rolled, using speed instead of turn, power instead of grace. A Zero caught one Hellcat in its sights and opened fire. Shells punched through metal. Flames burst from the wing. The American pilot stayed calm, rolled and dived toward the sea. At 5,000 feet, the fire died. He leveled out, smoke trailing behind. Engine still alive, he whispered to himself. Still flying. He turned back for home. Above him, his squadron kept fighting. Pairs of Hellcats moved together like practiced dancers. One drew the Zero's attention. The other attacked from behind, again, and again the pattern played out. Blue wings against silver, power against precision. Each clash ended the same way. The Hellcats came home. The Zeros did not. Below, the ocean glittered with sunlight and burning fuel. Ships maneuvered through the drifting remains of dogfights that had ended seconds earlier. Smoke trailed upward in long, thin lines, vanishing into the clouds. The battle was fierce, but short. The American formation regrouped and turned east. They had lost a few planes. The enemy had lost hundreds. Back on the carrier, deck crews waved them in. Wheels hit steel. Hooks caught cables. Engines sputtered and stopped. Men climbed out of their cockpits, faces pale with exhaustion and oil. Some smiled faintly. Others said nothing. They had seen too much sky turn to fire. The night after the battle, the sea was calm. Pilots gathered in the ready room, silent, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. They spoke softly about the ones who did not return. Then someone said what everyone was thinking. They are not gods anymore. No one answered. They did not need to. News of the victory spread through every carrier group, every airfield, every island outpost. It was the proof that had been missing. The Zero could be beaten. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was the turning of the tide. As the months passed, the Pacific changed color. Everywhere the blue wings appeared, control followed. Raids hit Rabaul. Truck Formosa convoys that once moved freely now hid beneath the cover of night. The ocean that had belonged to the rising sun began to belong to the storm. Pilots wrote home about the new fighter. They said it was steady. They said it was strong. They said that when the world went mad around them, the Hellcat stayed calm. Mothers and wives read those letters and smiled, not knowing the noise that came with each sentence. In the air, the pattern was always the same. The Hellcat climbed high, waited and struck from above. When the Zero tried to follow, its wings shuddered and broke. When it tried to turn away, bullets found it first. Each new pilot learned the same rule: use your strength, not his. And soon, the Americans no longer fought for survival. They fought for victory. The Japanese command could feel it too. Reports grew shorter, vaguer. Each loss was hidden behind words like mechanical failure or missing in action. But in the silence between lines, the truth was clear. They were losing the sky. The war was changing. The ocean that had once divided nations was now a single front. Every island mattered. Every pilot mattered. And above them all, the Hellcat watched. By early 1944, the Pacific had become a furnace of steel and salt. Each island was a fortress, each mile of ocean a battlefield. The United States Navy advanced slowly, island by island, with carriers as floating cities of war, and on those decks waited the Hellcats. Pilots no longer doubted their machines. They trusted the Double Wasp's deep, steady heartbeat. They trusted the armor that had already saved so many lives, and they trusted the tactics that turned speed and discipline into victory. The Japanese still fought with courage. But courage could not replace fuel or experience, the E. Veteran aces who had carried the Empire's flag through the first years of the war were gone. The men who filled their seats were younger, barely trained, flying against an enemy that had learned every one of their secrets. From the Marianas to the Philippines, the pattern repeated itself. Radar screens on American carriers showed new waves of attackers every morning. Every day the Hellcats rose to meet them, and every night, fewer Zeros returned to their bases. On one afternoon patrol near Saipan, 4 Hellcats intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by fighters. They attacked from above. Diving through cloud and sunlight, machine guns thundered. A bomber burst into flame. Then another. The escorting fighters tried to climb, but the Hellcats were already past them, looping back into the attack. By the time the sea swallowed the last fragments of burning metal, not one enemy plane remained. The pilots returned to their carrier in silence. There were no cheers, no celebration, only the quiet understanding that the balance of the war had finally shifted. The Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to keep up. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons for days at a time. Factories in Japan worked day and night, but shortages of aluminum and skilled labor slowed production. Engines wore out quickly, guns jammed, and replacement parts arrived too late. The Hellcat, meanwhile, was built faster than it could be painted. The assembly lines at Grumman turned day into night and night into day. Tens of thousands of workers, mechanics, welders, riveters, produced planes at a pace that no empire could match. Each new fighter was tested, accepted, and loaded aboard ships bound for the front. It was industry turned into strategy. The effect was devastating. For every Hellcat lost in combat, many more waited behind it. The Japanese had once believed that skill could triumph over numbers. But now, even skill was no longer enough. The Great Marianas battle had proven the Hellcat's dominance. Now it was a weapon of strategy area. Commanders planned entire operations around its range and power. It escorted bombers to targets deep within enemy territory, destroyed supply convoys, and swept airfields clean before amphibious landings. When the Philippines campaign began, the Hellcats led the way. They hunted enemy ships along the coasts, strafed rail lines and airstrips, and met each desperate counterattack with calm precision. In the skies over Leyte, a veteran Japanese pilot faced an American formation and realized with a chill that he was outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. He dove into battle anyway. His plane vanished in the first exchange. In 2 years, the roles had reversed completely. The Zero, once the hunter, had become the hunted. The Hellcat ruled the air. One American ace later described the feeling of those days. He said, We flew over a sky that belonged to us. We could choose when to fight. We could choose when to leave. That was the difference. Choice. They had none left. On the ground, the men who built the planes read the reports pinned to factory walls. They saw the numbers. Each zero destroyed. Each pilot saved and worked harder. They knew their effort was changing the war. Every rivet, every bolt was a heartbeat in the Pacific. By late 1944, Japan's remaining air power was fading fast, new. Pilots were sent into combat with little training and almost no hope of survival. Some were told their sacrifice would buy time for the Empire, but time itself was running out. Hellcat squadrons now patrolled from dawn until dusk. They flew in pairs, their engines steady and sure, their eyes scanning the endless water. Sometimes they met no enemy at all. Sometimes a lone zero appeared, fought bravely and fell into the sea, and sometimes the pilots simply watched the sunset over a quiet horizon, wondering how long the war would last. They had no idea that even greater battles still waited. Ahead, battles that would test not only machines but the spirit of every man who flew them. The Pacific had not yet finished its story. It, was only pausing to take a breath. The New Year brought storms to the Pacific. The sky turned gray. The sea grew restless, and the islands burned beneath the weight of the advancing war. From carriers and forward bases, the Hellcats rose again and again, engines roaring against the wind. Each mission carried them deeper into enemy territory. Each return brought them closer to the end of the empire that had once ruled the air. By 1945, Japan's forces were collapsing. Airfields were shattered. Fuel reserves nearly gone. The Zero, once the elegant master of the sky, was now a relic. Its pilots still fought with the same courage as before. But courage could not hold back the inevitable. The Hellcat was everywhere. Over the Philippines, over Formosa, over the coastlines of the home islands themselves. The war had become a machine, and the Hellcat was one of its engines. It flew escort for bombers that crossed entire oceans, guarded fleets against desperate raids, and patrolled empty skies where no enemy dared appear. Its pilots no longer felt the wild fear of the early days. They flew with focus, discipline, and a quiet respect for the men they faced. In the final months of the war, Japan turned to a new, desperate tactic, the kamikaze. Pilots, barely trained, were ordered to crash their planes into American ships. The Hellcats met them in the air whenever they could, trying to stop the attack before it reached the fleet. They shot down hundreds, but still some broke through. The courage of those young Japanese pilots was undeniable, but it was also tragic. They were the last echoes of a dying legend. For the men in the Hellcats, these battles were different. They were not duels. They were not contests of skill. They were attempts to stop death before it fell from the sky. Every time a kamikaze dove, the air filled with a terrible silence before the impact, and then it was gone, leaving smoke and sorrow behind. The Hellcats continued their patrols, unshaken, but changed. Victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like survival. Pilots who had once cheered their victories now sat quietly in their ready rooms, staring at the maps that grew smaller each week as the front advanced toward Japan. At sea, the carriers formed massive task forces that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Each deck was lined with Hellcats, bombers, and torpedo planes, all waiting for the order to launch. Each day began the same way. The alarm, the rush to stations, the engines warming in unison, the smell of fuel, oil, and salt filled the air. It was the rhythm of total war. From those decks, the Hellcats rose again, diving toward the enemy coastlines. Cutting through flak and cloud, they strafed airfields, attacked convoys, and escorted bombers that left the cities below in flames. At night, they returned home over a sea that glowed faintly with the reflection of distant fires. The pilots said little. They knew they were seeing the end. In those final months, the Hellcat had no equal. It had become more than an airplane. It was a symbol of the American advance. of the relentless tide that could not be turned back. It had achieved what it was built for, complete control of the air. Grumman's factories still worked without pause, though the engineers knew the end was near. They continued to refine small details: better cooling, improved visibility, cleaner maintenance lines. Each change was a note in a song that had already reached its final verse. One pilot described the feeling in a letter home. He wrote, "We don't fight the same way anymore. It feels like we are flying through history now. The enemy still comes, but the outcome never changes. We fly, we fight, we return." In that steady rhythm lay the truth of the Hellcat story. It was not a miracle machine. It was the result of learning, patience, and endurance. It was the product of every mechanic who tightened a bolt, every designer who refused to compromise, every pilot who survived long enough to teach the next. When the American fleets reached the shores of Japan, the skies above them were quiet. The Hellcats circled above the gray coastline, waiting, watching. The great battles were ending. The empire that had once laughed at them was silent, and the Pacific, after years of fire, was finally beginning to cool. The final phase of the war began with clouds hanging low over the Pacific. Rain fell across the flight decks, streaking down the folded wings of waiting Hellcats. Pilots stood by their planes, their faces older than their years, their eyes focused on the horizon. They had flown through storms, through fire, through endless sky, and now the end was near. Every sortie felt different. Each takeoff carried the weight of everything that had come before. The ocean that had once seemed eternal and invincible now lay quiet beneath them. Scarred but subdued, the Hellcat had done its work. It had carried men into the heart of war and brought them home again. Japan's air defenses were collapsing. Airfields were craters. Fuel was scarce. Engines sputtered to life only for desperate missions. The Hellcat swept through the skies without challenge, searching for anything that still flew. Sometimes they found nothing but clouds. Sometimes a lone Zero appeared, gliding silently, its guns empty, its fate certain. One American pilot later said, "It was strange. We had spent years dreaming of this moment, of flying without fear, and when it came, we felt no joy at all." Over the home islands, the Hellcats escorted bombers that carried the final blows of the war. They met the last remnants of Japan's once mighty air force and scattered them like leaves in the wind. The sky that had once belonged to the Zero was now filled with the steady drone of American engines. On the ground, the factories that had built the Zero were silent. Many stood in ruins. The engineers who had designed that graceful machine watched in disbelief as their creation vanished from the sky. They had built it to defend an empire, but no design, no matter how brilliant, can survive a war that outlasts its nation. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the pilots aboard American carriers heard the news over the radio in stunned silence. The war that had defined their lives was ending in a way none had imagined. There was no victory cheer, no celebration, only a long, quiet understanding that the world would never be the same. In the days that followed, patrols still flew cautious and alert, but there were no more dogfights, no more ambushes from the clouds, only a heavy stillness that hung over the Pacific like fog. Then the orders came: cease operations, return to base. The war was over. When the Hellcats turned for home, they flew in long blue lines over the empty sea. Some bore scars from battle, some were new and untested. All were symbols of the same truth: that perseverance had triumphed over pride, and learning had conquered legend. The carriers steamed east, their decks crowded with planes that had carried the war from one side of the ocean to the other. Men stood on the decks watching the sunset, thinking of all that had passed. The ocean that had once been the Empire's stronghold was now a path home. At Grumman's factory, word of victory reached the workers who had built the planes. For the first time in years, the machine stopped. The great hall that had echoed with the hammering of metal fell silent. Some workers wept, others simply stood still, unsure what to do with the quiet. The war was over, and so was their work. In the months that followed, the Hellcats were flown back across the ocean. Some went to training fields, some were dismantled, some were left to rest on forgotten airstrips. Their wings, once stretched wide against the sun, now folded for the last time, yet their legacy endured. Pilots who had flown them carried their lessons into the next era. Designers who had built them took their experience into the age of jets. The Hellcat had done more than win a war. It had taught a generation how to survive one. As the years passed, the Zero and the Hellcat became legends told side by side. One spoke of grace and speed, the other of strength and endurance. Together, they defined an age when courage met invention in the sky above the Pacific. And though the laughter that once echoed from Japanese airfields was gone, it remained a part of history, a reminder that arrogance fades, but the will to adapt endures. When the last Hellcat took off for its final flight, the men watching on the ground said nothing. They simply listened to the engine fade into the distance and thought of the years it had carried them through. The sound grew softer, and then was gone. The Pacific was quiet again. The war was over, and the sky, once filled with fire, belonged to no one. In the years that followed the war, the Hellcat rested beneath the calm skies it had once fought to control. Some were stored in hangars, their blue paint fading under dust and time. Others were melted down, their metal reborn into ships, bridges, and new machines for a world that wanted peace. But in the memories of those who flew them, the Hellcat never grew old. It remained as it had been, loyal, unbreakable, and fierce. Pilots who had faced the Zero in its glory remembered what it meant to fight an enemy who seemed untouchable. They spoke of the first time they realized the tide had turned, of how the fear that had haunted them for years finally began to fade. The Zero had been their teacher, forcing them to adapt, to build, to think differently. And the Hellcat had been their answer, a design born not of imitation, but of evolution. Historians later called it the perfect expression of wartime necessity. It was not the fastest fighter, nor the most beautiful, but it was the right plane at the right time, built by people who refused to surrender. It carried the lessons of every defeat into every victory that followed. For the engineers at Grumman, the Hellcat was the foundation of everything that came after. Its rugged design principles shaped the Bearcat, the Panther, and every naval fighter that followed into the jet age. Its simplicity became a philosophy: build it strong, make it reliable, protect the man inside. That thinking guided American aviation for decades. In Japan, the surviving pilots of the Zero returned home to a nation in ruins. They carried their own memories of flight, of loss, of beauty and tragedy. Some became teachers, passing on their knowledge of aerial combat to a new generation. They spoke with respect of their former enemies, of the machines that had defeated them but also earned their admiration. For them, the Hellcat was not a symbol of humiliation. It was proof of what determination could create. At memorials on both sides of the Pacific, the names of pilots, Japanese and American, were carved into stone. Visitors walked among them in silence, listening to the wind that moved across the open sky. There was no sound of engines now, only the distant echo of what had once been. The world that the Hellcat had helped to shape was one that longed for peace, even as it remembered the cost of winning it. Decades later, a few surviving Hellcats still flew. Their engines rumbled softly over air shows and coastlines, no longer instruments of war but voices of history. When they passed overhead, old men looked up and remembered. The deep growl of the double wasp still carried something of the Pacific within it: salt, sunlight, and sacrifice. A single Hellcat stands today in a museum, polished and perfect, its wings outstretched beneath quiet lights. Children press their hands to the smooth metal, asking what it was like when the world was at war. The guides tell them that this machine helped end it. They speak of courage, of invention, and of a time when the fate of nations was written in the sky. They tell of how the Zero once ruled that sky, untouchable and proud, and of how the Hellcat rose to meet it, built by ordinary people who believed that no legend was beyond challenge. It is a story of human will, of learning, adapting, and refusing to break. The Pacific remembers them both. The islands, the waves, the clouds, all still hold the echoes of engines long gone. The war has ended, but its voices remain. The Hellcat's was the loudest of all, not because it shouted, but because it endured. When the museum lights dim and the visitors leave, the Hellcat waits in silence, somewhere beyond the glass. Night falls over the ocean it once defended, and in that darkness, you can almost hear it again. The heartbeat of the double wasp, the breath of a machine that refused to die. It is faint, but it is there. A reminder that even the quietest sky was once alive with thunder, and that from the laughter of doubt to the silence of victory, the story of the Hellcat will never fade. Time has softened the memories, but it has not erased them. For those who were there, the Pacific War is never far away. They can still feel the heat of the carrier deck beneath their boots, still smell the mix of salt and oil and sweat that filled the air. They can still see the glint of sunlight on distant wings, the flash of tracers cutting through the blue. Those moments live on in silence now, kept alive by stories, by the few who remember, and by the machines that outlasted them. The Hellcat was one of those machines. It was not built to be loved. It was built to endure. And in enduring, it earned love in a way no designer could have planned. When young aviators in later decades studied its design, they were struck by its simplicity, thick wings, straightforward controls, a cockpit that felt like a fortress. No unnecessary polish, no fragile beauty, just purpose. Everything about it spoke of survival. In that simplicity lay genius. It was easy to repair, forgiving to fly, and merciless in combat. It was the kind of plane that treated skill and inexperience with equal fairness, demanding respect but rewarding courage. The pilot said that once you flew it, you trusted it completely. The lessons of the Hellcat went beyond metal and engines. It showed that progress does not always mean perfection. It means understanding the fight you are in and building what that fight demands. The Hellcat was the answer to fear. It was the embodiment of adaptation. In war, adaptation is survival. The Zero had been born in a world that prized speed and agility above all else. It was brilliant, a work of art made deadly, but it was fragile, and when the war changed, it could not change with it. The Hellcat could. It was built not to dominate a single moment, but to outlast every moment that followed. That was why it won. When the age of jet engines began, the Hellcat's roar faded from the skies. New machines replaced it, sleeker, faster, louder. But pilots who moved on to jets often said they missed the old fighter. They missed its patience, its forgiveness, its solid feel in the air. In the cold, screaming rush of jet combat, the Hellcat seemed like a memory of something human. In museums and airfields, a few of them still live. Their engines start with a cough and a growl, the propeller spinning slow at first, then faster, until the air trembles. Crowds watch, children cover their ears, and the old sound rises again, the sound of history breathing. The deep heartbeat of the double wasp fills the space, steady and strong, as if time itself were remembering. For a moment, everyone watching can imagine it. The carrier deck, the endless sea, the rising sun. They can see the blue wings lifting into the air, sunlight flashing along their edges, and hear the echo of pilots shouting over the radio. And when the plane finally takes off into the sky, the world below grows quiet. It is no longer war. It is remembrance. Every roar of that engine is a reminder of what humanity can build when it must. Every glint of sunlight on its wings is a reflection of every man who never returned. It is a voice from a time when courage and invention shared the same cockpit. Somewhere, high above the Pacific, that voice still lingers. The Hellcat's legacy is not just victory, it is endurance. The proof that strength guided by learning can reshape the world. Its wings may have folded, Its engines may have cooled, but its spirit still flies wherever stories of the war are told. And if you stand long enough beneath its shadow, you might hear it too. The soft whisper of a storm long past, and the quiet pride of a machine that once carried hope across the ocean. It will fade again, as all echoes do, but not completely. Because in every pilot's story, in every history written of that vast blue war, the Hellcat remains. It waits there, eternal in memory, under the same sky it once ruled, and the wind that moves across the Pacific still carries its song, low, steady, unbroken, the sound of survival. In the quiet years that followed, the world tried to forget the sound of war. Factories that once forged wings and engines turned to peaceful work. Runways filled with grass. Carriers that had carried hundreds of fighters across the ocean were turned into floating museums or scrap. The men who had flown the Hellcat grew older, their hair turning the color of sea foam, their hands trembling when they spoke of the past. But when they remembered, their voices softened. They spoke of the weight of the helmet in their lap before takeoff, the heat of the engine through the floor, the way the plane shuddered with power when the throttle opened. They remembered the long moments of silence before battle, when the sky seemed to hold its breath, and they remembered how it felt to come home, to see the carrier deck rising beneath them through smoke and cloud. One said, "I never thought of it as a weapon. It was my shield, it was my friend." Another said, "When you fly something that keeps you alive, you start to think of it as alive too." The Hellcat was more than metal. It was the sum of every life that had touched it, the mechanic who tightened the bolts, the engineer who drew the lines, the pilot who trusted it with everything he had. It was built in a time when mistakes cost lives, and every improvement was written in sweat and steel. That was why it endured. When historians look back on the war, they often speak in numbers, production counts, loss ratios, victories per sortie. The Hellcat's numbers are impressive, almost unbelievable. More than 12,000, built over 5,000 enemy aircraft, destroyed, a kill ratio of 19-1, but those numbers cannot capture what it meant. What mattered was what it gave to the men who flew it: confidence, security, a fighting chance. Every time a Hellcat landed with holes in its wings and its pilot still breathing, it proved the design's purpose: to survive, to bring a man home. That was its victory. Not the count of enemies defeated, but the count of lives saved. In the end, the Hellcat became a symbol of the kind of strength that endures quietly. It did not win through elegance or fear. It won through patience, through learning, through the simple idea that the best weapon is the one that protects its wielder. When people see it now, standing silent in museums or flying slow passes at memorials, they see more than a relic. They see a message written in aluminum and oil, that no challenge is permanent, that even the most powerful legend can fall, and that every defeat can teach the way to victory. The Pacific War is long past. The men who fought it are mostly gone. But sometimes, on a calm day near an airfield or a coast, you can still hear something in the distance, a low rolling growl, rising and falling like a heartbeat. It might be thunder. It might be an old engine remembering its purpose. The wind carries it away over the trees, over the sea, into the open blue. And in that moment, if you listen closely, you can almost believe that somewhere above the clouds, a single Hellcat is still flying. It moves slow, steady, and sure. Its wings catch the light. Its engine hums the old rhythm of the double wasp. And for a moment the world feels as it did long ago, vast, dangerous, and full of courage. Then the sound fades. The sky returns to silence, and history breathes again, quietly, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, the old pilots dream they are back in the cockpit. They can feel the vibration of the engine through their hands, the soft resistance of the control stick, the smell of fuel and salt mixing with the cold morning air. They look down and see the carrier deck below, the sea stretching endlessly beyond it. And for a moment the years fall away. The radio crackles. A familiar voice calls their name. And once again, they are young, rising into the sunlight, chasing shadows across the Pacific. In their dreams, there is no fear anymore, only the sound of the double wasp, smooth and strong, carrying them higher with every breath. They turn through the clouds and see another Hellcat beside them, wings steady, flying in formation as if the war had never ended. There is peace in that sky, no enemies, no fire, just memory and wind. When they wake, the silence feels heavier than before. The world outside is different now, quieter, slower, built from the lessons that machines like the Hellcat help to teach. Yet sometimes, when they hear an airplane pass overhead, their eyes still lift instinctively. For a heartbeat, they expect to see the blue wings again. The Hellcats. Story does not belong only to the war it fought. It belongs to every generation that learned what it means to adapt. It is a reminder that victory is not about perfection, but persistence, about listening, learning, and refusing to repeat the same mistake twice. It reminds the world that progress often comes from failure, that strength is built in the moments when everything seems lost. The men who built it knew that. They worked through sleepless nights, under pressure, under fear, guided by nothing but purpose. They did not build a monument, they built a lifeline. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. Every bolt that held the Hellcat together was a small act of defiance against defeat. Every flight it took was a statement that courage and intelligence could coexist. It was proof that the human spirit could take shape in metal and rise into the sky. Today, when people walk beneath its wings in museums, they see their reflection in the curved surface of its paint. They see not a weapon, but a mirror of effort, sacrifice, and the strange beauty of endurance. The Hellcat no longer needs to fly to do its work. Its message travels through time without engines or wings. It speaks quietly, but clearly. It says that every obstacle can be overcome. It says that failure can be rebuilt into victory. And it says that even when the world is at its darkest, there will always be hands willing to build and hearts willing to try again. The Pacific is calm now. The islands are green again. The coral reefs hide the bones of ships and planes that once tore the sky apart. Fish swim through the wrecks. Sunlight dances on the sand, and nature has covered the scars with silence. But if you dive deep enough, past the coral and the stillness, you can still find the metal frames of the old fighters. Their wings lie open on the ocean floor, covered in time, but untouched by forgetting. In that quiet blue world, history sleeps. The sea has claimed what men left behind, but not their memory. And every ripple on the surface above feels like an echo, a faint reminder of engines, courage, and the unending human desire to rise. The Hellcat will always be part of that echo, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. It carried the flaws, the hopes, and the will of the people who made it. It carried them through fire and storm and brought them home again. And that is all that any machine, or any person, can ever truly do. Somewhere, above a quiet ocean, the ghosts of that age still fly, invisible to the eye, but alive in the wind. They move through the clouds in endless formation. You can almost imagine their sound, that deep, rolling thunder of the double wasp, echoing softly across time. It is not the sound of war anymore. It is the sound of remembrance. Each flight tells the same story. Written not in ink but in sky, it begins with fear, it grows with determination, and it ends with understanding. The Hellcat was never just a machine of battle. It was a conversation between men and their limits, between invention and necessity. Its pilots learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is flying anyway, through the storm, through the fire, through the unknown. They learned that survival is not luck, but discipline. And they learned that every victory, no matter how great, comes at a cost that time cannot erase. When the last of them speak today, their voices tremble, but their memories are clear. They talk about the missions, the friendships, the long stretches of ocean that felt like eternity. They talk about how the world looked from 20,000 feet, where the horizon seemed endless and small at the same time. They talk about the moment when they realized the enemy below was not just an opponent, but another man trying to live through the same storm. War ended, but the lessons remained. The Hellcat became a teacher for those who came after, engineers, designers, leaders. It proved that strength without thought is brittle, that speed without purpose burns out too soon. And it proved that the power to endure is the power that changes the future. Its story became more than history. It became a reflection of everything humanity can be when forced to grow. A symbol of progress made not from arrogance, but from learning, from loss, from the courage to begin again. When children see its picture in a book, they might not know the details of the Pacific War. They might not know the names of the pilots or the factories or the islands, but they see something in its shape, the wide wings, the proud nose, the steady stance, and they understand it in their own way. They see strength that does not boast. They see power that protects, and they see hope built from struggle. That is what remains when the engines stop. That is what lingers when the sound fades. The Hellcat's wings are silent now, but their story still moves through time like wind across water. Each generation hears it differently, as history, as warning, as inspiration. But the heart of it never changes. Build with care, fly with purpose, endure, even now. Somewhere above the Pacific, the sky remembers. It holds the light of dawn over an empty ocean, the memory of two planes meeting in that vast blue arena. One built for grace, one built for survival. Both born from human hands, both bound by the same sky. The sun sets and rises again, and the wind carries their names across the waves. The Zero and the Hellcat, the teacher and the challenger, the myth and the answer. And though their time has long since passed, their story continues in every whisper of air, in every stretch of sky, in every moment when someone chooses to build, to learn, to endure. Because the war may have ended, but the sky never forgets. It holds their echoes still, faint but eternal, the sound of engines fading into peace, the proof that even in destruction, humanity can find meaning. That is the final legacy of the Hellcat. Not victory, not conquest, but understanding. The kind that comes only after the storm has passed, when the sea is calm and the horizon is open again, and somewhere, in that endless silence, you can still hear it if you listen closely. The slow, fading heartbeat of the double wasp, the sound of courage learning how to rest. When the stories of the Pacific are told now, they begin with chaos and end with silence. Between those 2 points lies everything the Hellcat represents: the rise, the struggle, the endurance, and the peace that followed. It is not just a chapter in history, it is a bridge between what humanity once was and what it learned to become. The Zero taught the world the danger of underestimating innovation. The Hellcat taught the world the strength of adaptation. Together, they wrote a truth that every generation would need to remember, that no power lasts forever, and that progress belongs to those who learn the fastest. When you look at photographs of the men who flew them, you see the same expression in every face. Calm, determined, exhausted beyond words, yet unwilling to stop. They were not heroes in their own minds. They were workers of the sky, doing what had to be done, one flight at a time. In the early light of morning, on the decks of carriers like the Essex or the Enterprise, the Hellcat stood ready with wings folded, waiting for the signal. Steam rose from the catapults, engines warmed with a low growl that built slowly into thunder, and when the flag dropped, they leapt into the air like arrows drawn by history itself. For the men watching from the deck, that sound was both terrifying and comforting. It meant danger. It meant defense. It meant that somewhere above the horizon, the war was being fought for them. Years later, when those same men sat beneath quiet skies, they still heard it sometimes in their minds, that deep rhythm of power and purpose. They said it was like the ocean itself had found a voice. And perhaps it had, because the Hellcat was born from the same elements: air, salt, and will. When technology moved on, the Hellcat became a relic, but not an ordinary one. It stood for something far greater than metal and rivets. It stood for the human ability to take what seems impossible and make it inevitable. Each rivet in its frame, each dent repaired between sorties, each oil-stained logbook entry was part of that greater story. It was the record of a people who refused to let defeat define them. The Hellcat carried that defiance into the sky, one mission after another, until even its enemies began to respect it not as a machine, but as a force of nature. And so in museums, in documentaries, in the words of the last surviving pilots, it continues to fly, not on wings, but in memory, not through air, but through time. Children look up at it, and though they may not know the sound of the double wasp or the terror of the open Pacific, they can feel what it means: resilience, determination, and the quiet strength of those who keep going when all seems lost. The world changes, but the essence of that lesson does not. It waits in every challenge that rises, in every struggle that tests what we are made of. The Hellcat's voice still whispers to anyone who listens: do not break, do not stop. Learn, adapt, survive. And somewhere far above the clouds, beyond where the eye can see, the echo of that voice lingers. A soft, steady rumble that never truly fades. It is the memory of a machine that became more than itself. It is the sound of the sky remembering what courage once sounded like. The Pacific still holds that memory. It drifts across the water at dusk, carried by the same winds that once filled the wings of war. And when the last light of the sun touches the waves, for just a moment, the horizon glows the color of burnished metal. It looks like a promise, the kind made by men who built something stronger than fear. That glow fades, the sea grows dark, and the stars return. But beneath them, in the quiet that follows, the world still breathes the same air the Hellcat once ruled. The old sky remains endless, the sea remains vast, and between them lies the story of a machine that learned to outlast time itself in the deep hours of night. When the world is still, the past drifts quietly through memory. It moves like a shadow across calm water, leaving only ripples that fade but never disappear. Among those ripples is the shape of the Hellcat, blue wings against the horizon, cutting through the mist of time. It has become something more than a fighter plane. It is a symbol of the moment when technology and humanity met in equal measure. It stands for the people who built, flew, repaired, and trusted it. It stands for every voice that refused to surrender when surrender seemed easier. Even now, when engines roar above modern runways, the rhythm of the Hellcat lives in them. Its spirit exists in every machine built to protect, to endure, to return home. Every engineer who studies its lines learns the same quiet truth, that perfection is not the goal. Purpose is. When the world entered the age of jets, the Hellcat's story might have ended, but instead, it grew. The pilots who once flew through storms became instructors. They taught younger men not only how to fly, but why. They taught that skill without humility leads to ruin, and that strength means nothing if it cannot be controlled. Their lessons reached beyond flight, into every craft, every trade, every nation rebuilding from the ashes of war. In Japan, young students read about the Zero and the Hellcat together, not as enemies, but as teachers. One taught the beauty of design, the other taught the necessity of endurance, and between them lay the story of human progress, written in metal and sacrifice. As the 20th century faded into the next, veterans grew old and fewer each year. The ones who remained carried their memories carefully, like relics. Some returned to the Pacific, to the islands where they once fought. They stood at the edge of the same beaches where smoke had once blackened the sky, and they listened to the sea. It sounded different now, calmer, forgiving. But in its rhythm, they could still hear the heartbeat of the war they survived. They closed their eyes and saw the old world again to woe. Deck crews waving them forward, the ocean stretching, wide and endless, the moment of weightlessness. before the carrier dropped away beneath them. They saw the sun on the wings of the Hellcat and felt, for just a breath, that they were there once more. Time cannot hold that feeling, but memory can. It keeps it alive in small ways, in the tremor of a voice, in the smell of oil, in the gleam of aluminum under museum lights. History is not silent. It whispers through details, through stories told softly in hangars and classrooms, through the steady hum of engines that carry its legacy forward. The Hellcat's final victory was not in the number of battles it won, but in the peace that followed them. It proved that war could teach something more than destruction. It showed that courage could evolve into wisdom, that even the most terrible conflict could end with a clearer understanding of what must never be repeated. Every generation finds its own skies to cross, its own challenges to rise above. And though the names change, the lesson remains: build with care, fight with purpose, and when the storm ends, choose peace. That is the true inheritance of the Hellcat, not its wings or its guns or its victories, but the calm that comes after, the silence earned by endurance, the understanding that nothing is stronger than the will to survive and to grow. If you stand on a coastline at dusk, where the wind smells of salt and distance, and listen closely, you might hear it, a faint hum, carried by the breeze. It could be the ocean, or it could be the memory of 1,000 engines, rising together one last time. It is not loud, it does not boast, it simply endures, because even when the planes are gone, and the men who flew them are dust, the story of the Hellcat remains, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who remember what it means to rise, to fight, and to come home again. The wind across the Pacific carries many stories, but few are as lasting as this one. It begins with doubt, it moves through struggle, and it ends with understanding. The story of the Hellcat is not only about metal and flight. It is about the moment when humanity learned that strength comes not from pride, but from persistence. Every warplane has a sound that defines it. The Zero's was sharp and bright, like a blade cutting air. The Hellcat's was deeper, steadier, a growl that spoke of power contained, not flaunted. When those sounds met above the ocean, the world changed. It was not just a battle for dominance, but a contest between philosophies. Lightness against armor, grace against endurance, myth against method. The Hellcat did not win because it was perfect. It won because it was enough. It did what needed to be done, and no more. It was a fighter stripped of vanity, a machine built for the single purpose of survival. That simplicity made it timeless. In the decades that followed, new generations of engineers studied its frame. They measured the angles of its wings, the balance of its weight, the shape of its fuselage. What they found was not beauty in form, but beauty in purpose. Every line was there for a reason. Every curve existed to protect a life. The Hellcat was honesty forged in aluminum. As technology advanced, flight became faster, colder, more distant from the man at the controls. But inside the Hellcat, every vibration, every gust, every shot fired could be felt. The pilot and the machine were one. That connection built trust, and trust built victory. In Japan, the memory of the Zero endured with equal reverence. Its pilots spoke of its grace, its balance, its ability to dance through the sky. They remembered the pride of mastery. The joy of flight before the war turned desperate. For them, the Zero was youth and brilliance and tragedy woven together. And when they spoke of the Hellcat, it was not with hatred, but with recognition. They knew what it meant to fly against a machine that refused to die. Two nations, two designs, two ideals, both destined to meet, to clash, and to learn from each other. And in that meeting, the sky itself was changed forever. Today, historians speak of the Hellcat's kill ratio, its production numbers, its tactical success. But beyond the statistics, there is a quieter truth. It became a bridge between fear and confidence, between chaos and control, between the world that was and the world that came after. The Pacific War turned vast and violent, yet in its heart was something human, the will to endure. The Hellcat carried that will across the sky. It taught that progress is not the creation of perfection, but the refusal to stop trying. It proved that resilience outlasts brilliance. And so, when you see a photograph of it now, resting on the deck of a museum carrier, wings folded like a sleeping bird, you are not just looking at an artifact. You are looking at the embodiment of a lesson written in smoke and steel, a lesson that says, rise again. No matter how fierce the storm, rise again. The Pacific remembers. The ocean holds the echoes of its battles deep beneath the waves. The sky holds the silence that came after, and the wind still carries the low hum of the Hellcat, that sound of defiance turned into peace. It is the sound of humanity learning how to survive its own creation. It is the heartbeat of a machine that became more than war. It became a mirror, showing both the darkness of conflict and the light of understanding that can follow it. And though the years will keep passing and the metal will fade, that sound remains. A whisper in the air, a lesson in endurance, a promise that what is built with purpose will never truly disappear. The Hellcat's wings no longer lift, but its spirit still flies, high above time, high above memory, into the endless blue that once burned with fire and now glows with peace.